Hi, I wanted to post a video this week going over one of our topics, comparative economic systems, where we'll talk about different countries and the economic system they choose, whether they choose a system of government control where the government owns and operates a lot of businesses and farms and factories, where government sets prices and determines where people might work and how much schooling they get, or they choose a market-based system where markets allow prices to rise and fall based on supply and demand. Entrepreneurs are free to open and operate business, and the government has a much smaller role in management of the economy. So I want to talk about some of these different systems and give examples of them. And we'll start with a system of communism or socialism where the government basically owns and operates most of the means of production in a economy. And here we see very little private property, very few businesses, very little ownership of private property, and we see very few private property rights. We see a large state control. State control of a lot of resources, meaning factories, meaning farms, meaning most of the resources used to produce and make goods and services in a socialist and communist system will be controlled by the state. Here we see very little labor freedom, where often people are not free to choose where they're going to work and what they're going to do and what field they're going to work in and where they're going to get their education and how much education they're going to get will largely be dictated by the government and by the state. And most importantly, in a socialist communist country, we see prices are strictly controlled by the government, where the government is going to set prices for goods and services by law instead of allowing markets and supply and demand to function and set prices and tell the market what things are worth and what their value is. Countries we see with a socialist communist system include, of course, China, which has some amount of trade and a small amount of private property, but make no mistake, China is still and will remain a communist country. We think, of course, of North Korea here. And we think of Venezuela, which might be the best modern example of a socialist country that has driven its economy almost to death with socialist policies that are absolutely not working for this country. And as we go forward here, I'm going to move on sort of a spectrum from less personal freedom and less freedom for individuals and businesses to more personal freedom. And we'll give examples as we go. And the next one I want to talk about, we're going to call a controlled economy, which is not necessarily a socialist state, because here we begin to see some degree of labor freedom where you can work where you want and maybe have access to more levels of education. But what we see under a controlled economy is still a large degree of state-run industries where the state and the government owns and operates a lot of the industry that the state manages. We see here, in order to support this industry, very high tax rates and very little very little business freedom, very little opportunity to open a business, and many barriers put in place. To entrepreneurs who might want to open a business or hire people or grow the economy, face a lot of regulation and red tape and state control. In a controlled economy, importantly, we see prices set and controlled at the government level, where prices are going to uh, be managed very tightly by the government and set by rule instead of being set by a market system of supply and demand and individuals engaging in voluntary trade deciding what they're willing to pay for things. When I think of a controlled economy, Egypt always comes to mind first, and much of the Middle East, really. Many Middle Eastern countries are what we would consider a controlled economy. Much of sub Saharan Africa is what we would think of as a controlled economy where you have very little individual freedom, some labor freedom, some private property, but very little, but large government sectors and large state run industry. Next one I want to talk about is what we'll call a mixed economy. And here, for the first time, we see some level of business freedom, but we see very high regulations where government takes a very strong regulatory hand in the economy. But here, for the first time, we're seeing labor and personal economic freedom. Personal economic freedom. We're seeing entrepreneurs here at the first time where entrepreneurs can sort of open businesses, and we see here private property rights are respected, and we see some degree of private property rights. We see other things like free and open immigration, obviously, where more people are allowed with government regulation to move in and out of the country, which socialist and communist countries very strictly control, and controlled economies put a large number of regulations and rules about who can come and go. In mixed and freer economies, we see much freer immigration in and out of the country. We see stronger property rights. And here, for the first time, we begin to see prices set by markets. Prices set by markets, people buying and selling, supply and demand, and prices that are allowed to move. And that brings us to a free market economy where virtually all prices are set by markets, where we have strong property rights in place. Uh, we have a lot of individual and economic freedom, and here we see a typically smaller government role in the economy. As far as regulation goes, we don't see free market economies have governments that own factories and own farms and take that advanced role. We don't see governments setting prices. We don't see governments assigning people jobs and telling you where to work. So these are our different economies that we're going to talk about. And I want to show you some examples of countries who have taken on these different systems. And I want to show you a couple different studies that have been done. And these studies are done every year. I'm going to start with Freedom House. Freedom House is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. that advocates for democracy and individual freedom in countries around the world. And as it says here, Freedom House rates people's access to political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and ranks it in its annual Freedom of the World report. So they look at freedom of expression and equality, and they look at where people are the most politically free. And I've got them ranked here from the most free to the least. Finland, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands are listed among the freest countries in the world. We often hear by proponents of socialism that the Nordic countries like Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark are this great socialist utopia where the socialist idea is thriving and coming true. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's absolutely not true. The Scandinavian countries are in no way socialist countries. They are simply mixed economies. They have labor freedom, they have individual freedom, they have entrepreneurs, they have prices being set by markets, they have individuals engaging in voluntary trade. These governments don't own large companies, they don't own factories. What they do have are simply more services provided by the government. More services like health care and child care are provided by the government, either through high taxes or through government management and regulation. Socialist and communist countries are where government owns and operates the means of production. This is not in place in any way in these Nordic countries. They're very, very free economies. As a matter of fact, we see here that Freedom House ranks some of these very, very high. We have to get down to the United Kingdom here at 94. And we see that many of these free countries are very prosperous. We look here and we see very prosperous countries. As a matter of fact, Freedom House has put this together in a map. They list their free countries in green. Partly free countries are in yellow, and the countries that Freedom House says are not free, where people don't have democratic freedoms and freedoms of expression and civil liberties, are in purple. And as we look at this, we see what we typically think of as very prosperous economies are very free economies. The United States, our Scandinavian countries, and much of Western Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, very prosperous economies and very free economies. Another study has been done on this, The Economic Freedom of the World by James Gwartney, and this has been done about for the last 24 or 25 years. Here's the one from 2020, where they're looking specifically at economic freedom. The freedom from regulation, the freedom to trade, the freedom of prices to move, the freedom of entrepreneurs to open, run, and operate businesses without high taxes and high regulations and burdens and government red tape. And when they look at the economic freedom of the world issue, this is done by the Fraser Institute, and other think tanks and academic groups around the world contribute to this. In 2020, they see that Hong Kong and Singapore retain the top positions. Other top scores went to free economies like New Zealand, Switzerland, Australia, the United States, Canada, Ireland, and they've put this on a map. And likewise, we see that what we think of as very prosperous economies tend to be among the most free here in blue. And here again, even economically, we see that our Scandinavian countries are among some of the freest in the world. And I want you to look at these and see the real correlation between a free and open economy where people are allowed to practice trade and an individual freedom. Individual freedom and a prosperous economy are intrinsically linked. And we see that in this system. We see that across comparative economic systems where free markets, free people, prices free to rise and fall, individuals engaging in voluntary trade and countries engaging in trade with each other raises living standards and makes life better for people around the world. So that's our talk on comparative economic systems. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.